What's going on, guys? It is the Coaster Battleman here, bringing you the 10 worst roller coasters I've ridden. 3 honorable mentions will be included, and I also have a few shoutouts to give to 2 different people. And shout out first to Mr. Pape, one of my teachers, for suggesting some more uploads and for subscribing to my channel. He told me some info on some rides in Florida at Disney World, mainly Avatar, Flight of Passage at Animal Kingdom, in the themed land Pandora, the World of Avatar, which is a new themed land that was built fairly recently in 2017. And a shout out to Theme Park Insanity for suggesting me to use pixelr.com to make custom thumbnails. I will give it a try in my next video, or maybe even in this video. Thank you so much, guys, for viewing my videos and being really big fans. And shout out to you guys. Let's move on to the honorable mentions. First, we have Flight of Fear, and this is a Premier Ride Spaghetti Bowl coaster at Kings Island and Kings Dominion, and we're going to go pretty briefly here. This ride has a pretty cool launch, and then after that, it's a pretty bumpy experience that's really jerky and just not really the most enjoyable. I mean, this ride has some pretty cool theming with a huge spaceship that you're inside in the station, and you enter the spaceship from the queue line. The problem with this ride is that it's just really, like I said earlier, it's pretty jerky, and not every row is the best. Some rows you get better rides than others. It's inconsistent and not really the best, but I will give it some slack because it has some really good theming that I really enjoy. Plus, the launch is really fun. Another honorable mention to be one of the worst is Nighthawk at Carowinds. This is the worst of the 3 Vekoma Flying Dutchmans. I mean, it's 2 now because Firehawk was removed in 2018, but of the 2 currently operating, this is still the worst one. Batwing is still superior, and this ride, despite having an okay color scheme and setting, it's just a really mediocre ride. It's shaky, it wasn't the most fun, it just wasn't as good as the others that I've ridden. Firehawk was my favorite Vekoma Flying Dutchman before they removed it, and I know Batwing is also superior to this as well. And it's just not really that fun in my opinion. Honorable mention number 3 is the Dark Knight coaster. This is a Wild Mouse coaster at Six Flags Great America and a few other parks that I don't really feel like mentioning. Six Flags Great Adventure and Six Flags Mexico, but we're mainly talking about Great America's Dark Knight. This ride has some really jerky drops, some jerky turns. I mean, despite having really cool theming, it's just not really the best ride. It's kind of boring, kind of rough. I mean, the theming's good, don't get me wrong, but other than that, there's nothing really else to really talk about with this ride being good. It's just not really that good. But next, we have the real top 10. 10th, we have Ricochet at Carowinds. This is my 10th worst roller coaster, and this ride is pretty bad. It's pretty jerky like the Dark Knight. The drops are really jerky. Everything I just said about the Dark Knight applies to this coaster. And another thing, this ride has no theming. Yay, no theming on this coaster. So it's not nearly as good as the Dark Knight. The Dark Knight's far superior to this terrible Wild Mouse coaster when it comes to theming, but overall with the ride layout, they're both pretty bad. And yeah, Ricochet is at number 10. Ninth is Hoosier Hurricane at Indiana Beach, and this is one of those wooden coasters where the front row was okay. It wasn't the worst. But then you go to any other row, and it's just terrible, and just unbearably rough, and not good. I mean, this coaster has steel supports and goes over water, and it's kind of an icon at Indiana Beach. But other than that, it's just not really my forte. It's not really my favorite ride. There, it's just mediocre. Cornball Express is better, a better wooden coaster there. Steel Hog is way better, and even their small Schwarzkopf coaster, Tiger, is better than this ride. This ride is not really that good. Pretty mediocre. It's not that fun. Number 8 is a surprise to many. It is Rock and Roller Coaster at Disney's Hollywood Studios. This ride is Aerosmith, one of the greatest rock and roll bands ever, and they're despite being one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time, their ride just isn't really the best. I mean, it's an indoor coaster. It has some cool theming in the queue line, like the Dark Knight, and it is similar to Flight of Fear, where it's indoors. It has a launch and several inversions inside the ride, but after that, it's just like not really that good. Like the trains have these bulky over the shoulder restraints, unlike Flight of Fear, which has lap bars, and the lap bars are so much better because there's no head banging. Flight of Fear is just a really jerky ride, and it's just not as good. But Rock and Roller Coaster, like if it had lap bars, it'd be way more fun. But because it's Disney, they have over the shoulder restraints, and it's pretty rough and not that fun. I mean, this ride has a solid first launch, and the music's pretty good, but other than that, this coaster is pretty bad and really rough and jerky, and not really the best experience. Number 7 is The Boss at Six Flags St. Louis, and like 2016 and before, this was one of my favorite coasters. It was awesome, and that's because I only rode it in the front row, and then boom, 2017 shows up. I try in some other different rows, and I do not like this ride ever since. This coaster, despite having some renovations in 2018, is still not that good. It's just like a rough ride. Like every time you go up one of the huge hills after a big drop, it just like really jerks you. It's just like the boss just a rough is just a rough ride. It's not really my favorite. I'm not really a big fan of this coaster, despite being in a great setting, having all the potential to be an RMC hybrid and to be one of the best coasters in the world. Six Flags has not bothered to put any money into Six Flags St. Louis besides putting some flat rides in. And I'm serious. In the next few years, 2021, 2022, 2023 even, Six Flags St. Louis needs to RMC the boss. And I am serious about that. Number 6 is Ninja, another Six Flags St. Louis coaster, and this is another bad coaster there. It's not as bad as I remember it from years past, but when like this year when I rode it, it wasn't the worst. It was still pretty jerky, but it wasn't as bad as it used to be. And I felt kind of relieved, and it was kind of a surprise coaster, and I thought it was okay, but overall, most of my ride experiences on Ninja, I only ride this coaster once or twice at the most when I go to Six Flags St. Louis, and every time it's just rough, jerky, and it's just not really that good. The layout's fine. It's just not really that good. It's a Vekoma MK1200. It has bad track profiling. It's just not really that good. Number 5 is Vortex at Kings Island, and this is a terrible roller coaster. Every inversion gives you insane headbanging. It's just terrible. Such a bad ride. I'm just kidding, guys. I'm not talking about that Vortex. Definitely not. Vortex at Kings Island is a solid ride. Unfortunately, it is closing, but this Vortex is not closing this year. The stand-up coaster at Carowinds, and I've rode this coaster twice back in 2018. The first time I rode it, I thought the first drop and the vertical loop were pretty solid, but the rest of the ride, in my opinion, was terrible. The second time I ride it, the whole ride was terrible. And this ride had a lot of head banging and neck banging and smashing just all over the restraint. Stand-up coasters are terrible, in my opinion, and Vortex definitely deserves some credit for being terrible. Number 4 is the original Mean Streak at Cedar Point, and this coaster in a nutshell, back in 2016 when I rode it one time in the summer when I went to Cedar Point for the first time. Front row, it was just plain boring. It wasn't the roughest. It was just boring and just not really that fast, despite the max speed being over 65 miles per hour. It's like 66 miles per hour to be exact. It just wasn't really that good. And it just wasn't the most enjoyable. And then I ride it in another row that's not the first row before it closes in September, a few months later, and it was just a terrible ride because it was so bumpy and jerky, and it was pretty boring. And just the roughness was just awful. Number 3 is Corkscrew at Cedar Point, and this ride is the definition of mediocrity. It's just a coaster like back in probably the 1970s, 1976 when it opened. It was an icon at Cedar Point. I mean, it's still an icon on the Midway today, and it's still pretty fun to watch, and it has some really nice colors. But overall, like, this coaster is really outdated, and it's just not that fun. It's just boring. It's rough. The inversions are mediocre. I mean, the other aerodynamics coasters like Carolina Cyclone, Demon, around similar sizes are a bit better. Even Corkscrew at Michigan's Adventure I prefer over this one, because it's a bit more intense. Like, this one is just not that good, and I really hope Cedar Point does a revival to Corkscrew and replaces it with an RMC T-Rex with a very similar layout to the original Corkscrew, but give it a vertical drop, an insane airtime hill, vertical loop. I've kind of went over a pretty cool layout for this coaster many times. Corkscrew, pretty bad ride. Number 2 is Wolverine Wildcat at Michigan's Adventure. I haven't ridden this coaster since 2016, but it's pretty bad. Really rough. The front row's okay. Any other row, it's unbearably rough. The layout has high potential to be an RMC hybrid, in my opinion, but Cedar Fair will not put the money into Michigan's Adventure for them to do that and make this coaster an awesome RMC hybrid that would attract more people to the amusement park. And they probably will not do that anytime soon. And number 1 is Steel Vengeance at Cedar Point. This ride is awful. It has the most unbearable rough drop ever. It's even taller, faster, and way more rough than it used to be. Everything about this coaster got worse. It's just terrible, unbearably rough. The inversions are bad. Everything's bad. This coaster is awful. I'm just kidding, guys. Again. And I have you guys know, Steel Vengeance is my 4th favorite roller coaster I've ridden. It's awesome. I thought you guys would rage quit this video. But if you're still here, number 1 is the Mind Eraser at Six Flags America. This is the ultimate worst coaster I've ridden. It is a Vekoma SLC, a clone, unbearably rough. And when I rode this, my head kept smashing the left side of the restraint. And over the shoulder restraints on this are so bulky, it hurt. And this ride, I felt like after this ride, my mind was erased. It was so bad. And I felt like my mind was erased for like 20 minutes afterwards. But then my mind came back to normal. But this ride is just unbearably rough. It's so bad. I mean, the layout is fine. It's just poor track profiling and execution. And Vekoma being not that good of a company. So, at the time that this coaster was built. But they have gotten better. But thank you guys so much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos.